Destinations together, won't you set me free? I'll take a train, a plane, a big cruise ship, it doesn't really matter to me. Destination people always seem to find the magic and the mystery in this beautiful world. Don't get left behind.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Anderson, and this is Webinar on Wednesday with Destinations Together. As always, a warm welcome to our Zoom listeners and cruise line executives that are tuning in. We have now passed the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, and the warnings of possible increase of COVID cases are seemingly never ending. Time will tell what the real impact will be. In the meantime, more positive news regarding vaccines and therapeutics are making the headlines. Distribution and defining who gets the vaccine when are now the primary focus. Nevertheless, there is a realistic expectation that our world could be back to semi-normal by early summer. Likewise, air travel is on the rise, so conventional wisdom would suggest that cruise travel is not far behind. But as we all know, there are many unique obstacles and challenges that the cruise industry must navigate for a successful restart. This is why we're really excited about today's webinar. The team at B&A, under the leadership of Louis Ajamil and Mark Ittel, have been globally focused on the port of call protocols, as well as the home port requirements necessary to restart the industry. The depth and breadth of this session is rich in content and value. Our speakers will focus on scalable solutions and protocol applications. They'll discuss operating models as well as tour operations and specific recommendations to help support you and your teams to manage a successful restart in your port of call. Today's presentation is hosted by Destinations Together, which is an open platform of relevant information and collaboration to support the tourism industry. It is designed to help everyone connect, collaborate, and find solutions to bridge the gap until cruise ships and tourism return to your region. Larry and I have a wealth of experience in the cruise industry, especially in relation to destinations and shore excursions. Specifically, we focus on development of guest experiences, destination analysis, product development, business strategy, sustainability, and more. Please contact us to discuss the specifics of your business so we can assist you. I'll turn this over to Larry to share some important information and then introduce our guest speakers for today's Destinations Together webinar on Wednesday. Larry?
Hey, thanks, Tom. We want to thank everybody for joining us again today. Appreciate it. First off, I want to thank Carlos Torres for the webinar he did on November 18th. Carlos is partnered with a healthcare provider, WeCare, to deliver a turnkey solution to manage the CDC guidelines for COVID testing and intend to protect the sailing public, the crew, and partners' destinations. If you missed it or any of our other webinars, please check us out on our website. All of them are listed. Before we begin, let me remind you of a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and we'll upload it in the next couple of days, I'm sorry. There's a Q&A tab below on your screen. We look forward to getting your questions to pass on to Louis and Mark. Mark will be answering some of them by typing in the answers, so look out for those. We encourage you all to vote on the questions listed so that we can ensure the most relevant ones are being answered. Please remember, we and our guests are only providing our opinions and possible sources for intel. Louis and Mark, please join me as I provide a quick introduction. Today's webinar is presented by Ajamil and Ajamil and Partners Inc., B&A, which is one of the leading ports and maritime planning and development firms worldwide. We are delighted to have Louis Ajamil, CEO and President, and Mark Ittel, Senior Vice President, Ports and Maritime, which have been actively involved in working together practical solutions for cruise industry from the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. With that being said, Louis and Mark, I turn today's webinar over to you.
Thank you. I think Louis is there.
I'm here, but my camera, I don't know if everybody can hear, so you won't be able to probably see me. My camera says it won't turn on, but here we go.
Here we go.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Tom and Larry, for this kind invitation, and I want to say hello to everybody out there. And joining me, as Larry has said, Mark Ittel, who directs our maritime practices. Just a bit of background. We put together this presentation now working with the ports and many destinations really out of the desire to be able to help people out think through the issues. We were very frustrated when the beginning of the epidemic and the shutdown of the industry, that to us, it seemed like most people were waiting for direction from somebody else, like all of us were. And it became rather apparent that there was so much work that everybody needed to do that the idea of waiting for another person or another entity to provide direction was just going to slow down the process immensely. We are now in a position that the restart, certainly in North America and the Americas, is close at hand, and yet there's a lot of work to be done. So we started with a presentation back in May, dealing with homeport operations and how homeports could get ready. And what I tried to do is take a look at beyond the ship, which is at the beginning, a lot of the concentration of the cruise lines. What did they need to do on board the vessels? We started working with this port of call options based on a number of assignments that we had. So we hope that this presentation gives you a lot of room for thought and leaves you with the impression that there's a role for everybody to play in trying to get this process restarted, because the options are not good. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I hope everybody can see it. And if we do, I will get it started.
All good.
Great. So we are in the I guess privileged position of having worked so much around the world with all the major cruise lines, with significant number of the ports, that we felt that we were in this position that we had a lot of access to information and discussions and one-on-ones with the parties that allowed us to do some brainstorming and thinking for what would happen and what solutions could be. So this is a presentation that we've done now it's very new, it's only a few weeks old, and we've done it in Europe and in Asia, so we're glad to be able to share it with all of you out there. The presentation is updated almost daily, so I always start with a little bit of a glimpse that comes out of our dashboard that we have on our website, that tries to provide information, and everybody that would like to have access can have access to it. So we have gone in a few months from a world that most of it was red, which meant that it's closed, to now some restrictions, some places turning into opening with certain restrictions, or in the case of the CDC in the United States, with certain things that need to happen before that. Europe is way ahead of everybody in having restarted, and nobody's open. Everybody is operating under certain limitations or restrictions or guidelines, and they have varied with this last spike. Some countries have closed again, but things are happening everywhere. And to give you an idea of things are happening, this is the chart of how many ships are sailing in the world. The one on the bottom left is what we're sailing and what we expected on October 1. Today, December 2nd, you can see there's less ships, but the amount of berths that are now sailing around the world is growing. So things are happening. It's not, for people that are places that are not seeing any activity, don't despair, because activity is occurring, and you can begin to see that 82% of the fleet still pending resumption, but there's 18% of the fleet is either operating or has been withdrawn. This chart of when cruise lines have made their announcements that they would like to restart is also a moving target. Originally, a lot of the North American lines wish they would have started in this fall of this year, and they all slowly retreated to the beginning of 2021. And since the CDC announcement, they've actually shifted from the January to April date. And we expect that there'll still be some movement based on the processes that need to happen, whether it's in the United States, Australia, or in other places in order to open. But what's sort of interesting about this is that, number one, everybody's announced that by April, everybody would have restarted. So we are now in December. So all this process is upon us now. It's not a few months from now, it's now. And there's a lot of work to be done. The second thing is that the big lines have announced that logistically, all the ships won't go into play at once. It will take them time to sequence them in. So whenever in the beginning of the year they restart, it will probably take the entire year 2021 to have the entire fleet operating throughout the world and the capacities that they need. But this is I think gives you a good glimpse of what to expect and when lines will be restarting. There's also a lot of talk about ships that were withdrawn or that we see anticipated to be withdrawn. And this chart basically shows you the vessels that are withdrawn almost on a yearly basis. Every year you can see 5,000 to 10,000 lower berth that are withdrawn because the ships reach their age or maturity. And there's this spike in 2021. One thing that is very important, this does not signify that the industry is consolidating. When you look at the ships that have been announced that have either withdrawn, scrapped, or sold into non-cruise activities, they are the ships, the obvious ships that were reaching their maturity and their lifespan. So in a few years, these ships would not have been available anyway. So when once look forward 2 or 3 years from now, all COVID ended up doing is accelerating the withdrawal of those ships by a few years, and it won't have an impact long term. And of course, some of those ships, most people see them and they recognize which ones they are. So with that, let's turn to the protocols. And there are 3 things basically that we base our protocols, that any port or any city or any country is basing their protocol. There's really have to be 3 major components to it. The first one, which was not articulated until really recently, is what is the standard of care? What is the outcome that these protocols are wishing to achieve? They're very silent. I think not just with the cruise industry, in other places, people then started saying, well, we're gonna provide hygiene, we're gonna measure temperature, we're gonna do different things, but that doesn't clearly articulate where you want to end up. And without that, it's very hard to restart anything or provide any confidence to the consumer. Now you can hear the cruise lines clearly saying that what they would like is to make the cruise industry what it can be, which is the safest vacation product around. And they would like you to be on board a vessel that you're safer from where the place you came. It's not perfect. There's going to be cases, but the protocols are set up to create that standard and then to be able to deal with cases when they occur. And when you look at the history over the past 2 months with the cruises that are sailing, with the exception of the first restart, the first ships that restarted, since then, that's exactly what they've been doing. They've been keeping caseloads significantly further down than actual caseloads around the world in other places. And they've been able to manage any cases that have resulted. The second thing is that the transition is that it's about the journey. That is not just, you can't control the entire experience and the entire health of your customer if you don't worry about from door to door, which means ports, home ports, ports of call, the ship, and many other things now have to fit in that role. And the third, which is really important because people are now focused on this, what is the solution for when a restart? It has to be scalable. With time, the disease will wane, and the idea to be able to tone down whatever protocols has to occur. So when you look at the entire cruise journey, door to door, today we're going to be talking about what happens in shoreside and port. And after you think through, and we thought through it is really one of the most complex parts of the journey, because once you're on board and you're able to control everything that goes through the doors of the ships, and the same thing in the home port and the embarkation, disembarkation, it is the shore side that if it's going to reach the potential, it requires a lot of interaction with communities and people and tours. Complex, to say the least. So the basis right now that we're living with is a combination of steps that have occurred now since the beginning of the summer. First starting in Europe, when in Europe, rather than a CDC approach, because that is the European Union, they provided guidance to the cruise lines. And guidance were very prescriptive of things that needed to happen. Among them, one of the key issues with CDC picked up is the interoperability of the plan, which means ports and the cruise lines have to be interoperable. The two have to fit. And that's one of the cornerstones you'll see on the CDC plan. And then physical things that have to occur on land. But they were not mandatory. So what has happened in Europe is that different ports, different cruise lines took those guidelines, implemented it, and now each one has different guidelines. So there are ports that are totally different from one another, and there are cruise lines that are totally different from one another, which is creating a confusion now in a system where you have multiple customers coming in and each one requiring a different parameter to operate. The Healthy Sail Panel, everybody's pretty familiar with it, and basically had 5 cornerstones from testing, screening of the customers, the sanitation and ventilation on board the vessel, then response to contingency planning, destination excursion planning, and how to deal with crew. Today, we're going to talk about destination excursion planning, but even in the Healthy Sail platform, they saw that interoperability between local government and cruise lines in the necessity that these plans be approved by all parties. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. And then Canada has not moved beyond that, and we're all expecting what Transport Canada will undertake. But basically, Transport Canada responded with a shutdown for ships over 500 passengers, which then translated extending to ships that are under 150 total crew and passengers, and that has been extended until February 28th. This is critical because without Canada, all the northern cruise destinations will not have any business. And then comes the CDC, and the CDC issued their guidelines over what you would call guidelines or directives in 5 tranches. The first one, the shutdown on March 14th, then the shutdown with more direction to provide for the crew repatriation on April 15th, further information on that on July 16th. On September 30th, they extended it and kept the same guidelines. And then on October 30th, they issued the new guidelines in which they are providing the ability for this restart process to occur if certain things occur. And since then, cruise lines have been rushing to get through. And there are very, very basic things when you look at CDC. The first thing they're asking is for everybody to establish a capacity for testing on board and off sites. Second is what is going on behind the scenes now is to get ready for these simulated voyages to test the protocols that each line will have. And they're still focused on individual line protocols. So we're still heading down the path that potentially communities, ports, destinations might be facing multiple protocols. If those are successful, CDC will then issue certifications to allow the cruises to start under certain conditions and under a short leash. So CDC will be monitoring what happens in those and with the ability to actually modify, change, and even shut down the cruises if they see that the system is not working. This certificate is interesting because it requires certain things of everybody. First, it requires that the operator must document approval of all U.S. ports or local health authorities where the ship intends to dock. So this is not just cruise lines saying, I'm going to go take the ship there. There's an approval and an interaction that needs to occur that goes well beyond what normally happens in a relationship between a cruise line and a port. Identification of quarantine areas. And really an important one, which is sort of lost in the translation right now, is that they can anticipate that in certain ports that are really busy, particularly in the Caribbean and Alaska, where on given days there is a overcapacity of passengers, that a port needs to establish what that peak capacity is. That's really important because if the restart occurs and any given port says we cannot handle, our system cannot handle more than X number of ships, then and more are coming, that's an issue. On the restricted passengers, I think this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this relates more to the ship, but it is just limited to 7 days, which is the big one. And the second one is that the ships could be canceled if they hit a threshold, but the threshold is not defined. So it's yet to be defined what that threshold is. It's more than one, but it's this entire process. So what this points out that this entire system is going to be under significant pressure, not just to restart, is to be able to maintain a consistent and sustainable operation without having to pull back. And that would be the worst thing that could happen to the industry and to everybody. In terms of testing, CDC is saying to all the cruise lines, everybody's got to be tested. Everybody's on board the ship by December 29th. So we're going to get a clean slate at that point and a clear picture. And from then on, everybody's got to be tested. And they are very specific. And this is an area that yet really needs a lot of work over the next few months. But it is saying that every passenger has to be tested at embark and disembark on the day of embarkation or disembarkation, not the day before, not 3 days, not 48 hours, not 72 hours. It doesn't even say it's 24 hours. It says on the day. So clearly there's a lot of room for discussion here on how this is going to be applied. And if you read it by the letter, it means ports of calls are no different than a home port. So will a passenger that get off at a port of call be subject to this provision? If my business depended on it and I want this business to come back, I would argue the worst possible case and be ready for that, which is yes, you will need to test. Ships obviously have to have testing on board and the ability to disembark and isolate crew and passengers that have symptoms or asymptomatic but are positive, and then the ability to manage that. But that's mostly on board. So I think when you look back now at where we are, I think the process up to now, after the shutdown, the cruise lines spent a significant number of months privately assessing the options, hiring experts, coming up with their plans. And I would say that by and large, ports or communities have spent most of that time waiting for direction. That was, if there was one common theme when you spoke to ports and communities, they said, we're waiting for the cruise lines to give us some guidance, because that's the normal process. But now here we are, and you have a CDC that's saying, no, ports, you have a different role in this process. In Europe, cruise lines began to releasing their protocols, but it doesn't require this relationship that CDC is requiring. And in most places, they were reacting to those guidance. But in the US now, it's in order to get started, you need to meet this. So as a whole, our general assessment, there are exceptions that most people, this idea of waiting for somebody else, they're still sitting there waiting and unprepared. And that's the goal of this presentation, to give you an option of views of things that need to happen to get everybody ready. Because it is going to be a very challenging thing to get ready, considering that some ships might start operating in January or February. Not a lot of time. They're right around the corner. And ports of call, without a doubt, pose the most complicated challenges. So scalable. On the issue of scalable, even like security, where you have these MARSEC levels 1, 2, 3, we see it the same way for health screening. And we see it not because just this pandemic. We see this as a system that could be implemented in the future to deal with issues like this, to make the industry resilient and more sustainable. So before the pandemic, we were at level 0, in which there were health questionnaires, there was normal sanitation on board. We were trying to take care of typical illnesses on board the vessel. And now here we are, and although people throughout the entire 2020 were saying, well, do we test, do we not test, and so forth, we are at 100% testing regime coming into North America. So we're going to be at highest level 3. But that doesn't mean that it has to extend beyond that. There are periods of time that as the virus begins to wane and whether it's vaccines or whether the systems begin to work, in which other health protocols might continue. And it might be less testing, it might be non-mandatory testing, it might be relaxation of social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. And that articulates the ability to have scalable protocols, which will impact every single aspect of the journey within a port of call. So for example, you could get to a point that testing is not mandatory, but social separation is. And if social separation is, tours are affected. So there is a process here that needs to be well thought out, not just focus on you're either level 0 or level 3, because there are implications. Obviously, this is a chart that we produced months ago that wasn't we're just saying, we just read a lot of the stuff. And we saw that the backdrop of the disease obviously changes as testing has improved, therapeutics improved, now vaccines to be deployed, and eventually eradication. And in that process, cruise lines have begun to operate selected, and the initial opening of some of the lines. Then we're going into a period of partial operations as the fleet begins to go into place. And then as the fleet begins to operate under restrictions, whether it's capacities and so forth, until we get to normal operations. So those levels of protocols will go a long way and will be very, very helpful in future operations. And defining that in each community will be very important, and it will go alongside of ship capacity. The two are inextricably tied. There are some issues in the protocols, whether it's the time for testing or social separation, that will affect ports to be able to operate. You just can't get people fast enough if you have them socially separated. You can't get them out of the ships fast enough to take the tours, or ships will take more time to at the home port. But while there are lower capacities, they can do it. If they were to go to 100% capacity and not reduce the protocols, it just will not work. So I'll talk a minute about that. So in protocols, I mean, it is in most places the process that pre-existed the COVID was the most simplest of all. The ship arrived, there was some level of routine document check, and then people were quickly escorted to their destinations, tours, or visitations. Now, we not only have to maintain social distancing, but it is clear that some level of health check coming in is going to be required, because CDC is just as focused on the health of the community as well as the ship. If anything, more interested in the health of the community, that a customer from a ship doesn't contaminate the community. And then what happens if the person fails? Does it go back to the ship, or the port have to provide a quarantine isolation area and the ability to evacuate that passenger? And this is one of the questions that needs to be arranged. It is not clear. So if somebody is tested positive with COVID, will they allow them to return back to the vessel? Probably not. So this is an important question for everybody to answer. When returning an embarkation, it used to be fairly straightforward again, at some level of document check, security, and on board. And now we're going to be looking at systems that will provide some kind of health state. And then these have to be very fast. You got to maintain social separation. If you clear, you can go in. But again, if you don't clear, there might be the need for testing on land before that customer can go back on board the vessel. And further testing, if you do a rapid test versus a detailed test, to actually try to clear up the reality of what that customer will have. So it is not clear today if this can occur on land or in the ship. It is, from the knowledge that we have on the ship, there's not a lot of room in there to be able to do these functions if the entire ship has to go through a primary health station upon return. So under these protocols, there are certain things that become very evident. These are pictures from Europe, and you can see, number one, the space. Some of it, it's not very expensive to do, but you need to be able to plan and do it, to provide the queue lines, to provide the stationing of the tour buses so that they're not in close proximity, that the buses are the way that you enter and exit, the capacity of the system heavily reduced. And even things like security, which in a lot of protocols is done on board the vessel, there might not be, there will not be, today as it is, there is not enough room there if you have to maintain social distancing on board the vessel. So will that have to be pulled on land, and whether it's a tent structure or an old warehouse, and be able to use that? In terms of testing, the reality is that it is not the complexity of the facilities that we need. As you can see, the very simple isolate, partitions and so forth. You just have to have the space, and you have to have the systems in place to be able to do it. And with the number of people, that's sort of the crux of this. Finally, is the whole issue of time to be able to move people under social separation. Under a 3,000 passenger vessel, the blue lines represents how many minutes it would take to disembark the entire ship using one gangway or two gangways. So between 25 minutes and 40 minutes. But if you have to pull people apart 2 meters or 6 feet, you can see what happens. It's 2 or 3 times longer. If the ship is bigger, the same thing. If the ship's even bigger. So this is really key, because this is occurring every time a disembarkation or embarkation occurs. I think most cruise lines are well aware that it's going to take them longer to do this process. And it will mean that the implication on tours and visitations will be dramatic. So maybe less visitations, less time in port, or extending the port visit, which means then another port will be skipped. And along the way, if there are facilities, they really need to be carefully thought out, whether they are placed with temperature screening systems, disinfection tunnels, but more importantly, the biggest is ventilation systems. It is very clear that the ventilation system, recycled air through air conditioning, is where the whole thing starts and ends in terms of a space. So whether or not you have the ability to break the recycle into fresh air, open up windows, or disinfect the air is sort of has been a critical one, and that takes time. So a ship is able to deal with all of these, and a ship arrives at a port. How could they operate? And what we want to show you is what's happening and what the potential options are. I think the best potential that you could have is really around the concept of the bubble. It's been used very successful in sports, in many functions, where you create a geographic boundary that is protected, and anything that moves in and out of that space has to meet a certain protocol. So if the protocol on the ship, everybody gets tested every day, the protocol inside the bubble has to be better, or equal or better than what happens if it's going to be approved. So it's a huge challenge for communities to be able to deal with it. So the reality is that not everybody will be able to deal with it, and there are different ways that you could think about a bubble. And we came up with 7 different ways to think about it, from a no visitation bubble, which means they don't come, to what we call an integrated bubble, which now we have an example. Clearly, from A to G, the first ones are the least attractive for a community, because it's going to limit the impact or ability to have access to those customers to run your tours, or to be able to enjoy shopping and experiences in the communities. So we ran a couple scenarios up in Alaska for a couple of the towns there. They've asked us to come up with ideas on how they could deal with it. And clearly, Alaska would be one of those that would mimic what happens in Europe. In Europe, the restart in Germany was cruises to nowhere. So the answer was there was no visitations, and this is, that is the case. So if Canada were to open up, and the communities were not ready to be able to take care of the customers when they arrive, then the cruise ships would probably just sail out of the home port and go visit the glaciers. And as long as they touch a Canadian port and a U.S. port, they're good to go. So the ability to create different scenarios like that is real and puts pressure back in the community that you have to be ready. So this is not a desirable income. The second part, I'm going to use a couple of examples here. This is all about Ketchikan here, just to give you an idea. The second one is the more simpler one. Create a bubble around a port. The port is already a secured area, sealed. And then rather than allow passengers to leave that, you allow vendors, merchants, and activities to operate within that bubble. Not very desirable, but it's certainly a possibility, and it would require all of the protocols that we said about anybody that enters that bubble has to meet as if they were on board the vessel. Then there are many communities in which that bubble you can begin to expand it. In this case, there are contiguous pieces of property adjacent to the port that actually have shops and restaurants, and it has actually a venue or show that they give, a lumberjack show in this case, access to some of the tour boats and so forth. Well, you could expand the bubble in that area and still control it. And it would be similar to when they do a Grand Prix or they do an art show in a community where you have to pay and there's controlled entrance and it's temporary fencing. But again, it goes back to everybody that enters or anything that enters has to fit within the protocol. Then you have the European model, in which the bubble is not physically geography. It is a tour-based model and is highly controlled. And that is the cruise lines enter into a deal with a tour operator, and the tour operator then has to meet that standard. And they will take the customers either on a bus, they won't get out of it, or they'll go to a place where, again, it's a bubble. So what happens is in Europe and in some places that might work very well, in the Caribbean and other places where there's a lot of independent offerings and there's a lot of things in the community that are dependent upon the cruise business, this is also not a highly desirable. It could be a mix and match. But bear in mind also, it is not up to the cruise lines to set that standard. The ports have to agree to what that standard and that protocol is. Then you can continue to expand the bubble. In this case, and we expand it into other areas of this town. But this one has a road going through. So what it means is two bubbles and then controlling access from one side to the other. So it's just providing options to the community that if your business is on the other side of that yellow line, and if you're not inside the yellow line, you're out of business, to provide as many options as possible for a community to be ready to be able to accept customers and at least have a shot at making a business for 2021. The other two are really now, certainly in North America, are not possible, which is, can you create a bubble around a city or an island? In the case of Alaska, originally when we did this months ago, there was a possibility because to get into any of these towns, you had to be tested. Unfortunately, there's other things that are coming in, which now has created more cases of COVID, which would probably not pass the test. Or even broader, that the entire state of Alaska provides an integrated model. Well, believe it or not, this is the model that's being used in Singapore. In Singapore, the protocols that now is being used does not require 100% testing. And when you look at it, is the entire country of Singapore. Yesterday, they had 5 cases, total of 5 cases. So their ability to control the virus is just as good within their boundaries as it would be within any of these other bubbles. So they have, as a government, allowing this, which makes a lot of sense. So each one obviously has a lot more effort and a lot more opportunity. But also bear in mind that the models might also be scalable, that when there is no pandemic, you could operate wide open, that everything is ready to go. But as you're operating under tighter pandemic, you might only be able to operate under the middle ones. And all we're trying to say is that this scalable could go both with the protocols and with the models. And the idea is to allow people to get into business as quickly as possible. Another example, another town in Alaska, this is the port bubble. This is the bubble with the area wide in which we expanded and include some tour operations. And then these are smaller towns. You could even close part of the town or the entire town. So what is important is you can't do this in isolation. The cruise lines and the community have to do this together. And as an itinerary, they should all be in coordination with each other. They might not be identical, but the protocols are the same to be able to provide guidance that you're meeting all of the guidance so that the restart can start. If not, we'll tell you what the European experience. It is not mandated from above. It was up to the cruise lines to come up with their protocols, get the necessary local approvals in their country. And they were all basically saying, okay, I'll set my standards. I will elevate all my sanitation and cleaning. I will maintain social distancing. And then I will pick the tour guides and drivers to operate under certain protocols. And that's how we will manage it. So it is the basic thing. They're in the same boat. They got to get started. And this provides a vehicle that if the community as a whole is not coming up with a solution, this is a solution that they will gravitate to. What happens is, and where we're heading is that everybody has to be aware that every cruise line might have slightly different protocols. And right now, most communities don't have a protocol that matches what cruise lines are going to be looking at. But that doesn't mean it can't change. So there is a lot of things that are forcing us as a business community and serving the cruise industry to come up with a solution that's a smart solution. Not dissimilar when restaurants were shut down in many places, but outdoor dining could, and many cities closed their streets so the restaurants could spill over and operate that way. So just clever, smart solutions, and any one of these options can provide that. So whether or not the systems for tours still continues to be with less people, which means less capacity, using different systems for communications, etc., how you allocate spaces and so forth, it's really critical. For tour and a commercial application, I think everybody's in the boat in North America. Everybody's looking for a solution and everybody's very concerned about their business. And obviously 21 is critical. After 20 being shut down, 21 has to be a successful year. And again, most tour operators, when we did these surveys back in July, we're still waiting. But most of them are equipped to be able to deal with it because they've dealt with it with norovirus and other things. They're just looking for solutions. So the dynamics need to change. Obviously, a lot of different tours. Each one has to be thought out carefully and put into the mix if you want to do it. But there are really 4 distinct tour operations within a bubble. One is the ones that only cruise lines approve, and that's it, which means independents and all the others. You'll have the haves and the have-nots. A lot of social strife from that. Second is to expand that tour operations to add things beyond just the large bus tours, social separation. 3 is create a system of pre-approved independent tour operators, and then create the protocols that would allow all tours to be able to operate, which I just discussed. So it's critical. The steps are the same whether it's tour or commercial businesses and food and beverage, is identify the ones that are going to participate, define what the protocols are going to be, certify and approve those protocols, and then be able to have great communication between the city, the country, the island, the brand, the independent operator, etc. So bear in mind, the only reason that the whole concept of broadening this base for ports of call, the only reason you want to have cruises come in is to impact your community in a beneficial way through economic benefits. If at the end all they come and just and have a very limited impact, the return benefit ratio is limited. So it is, the question then begs, what does the local government and what is the community? How does it do this? Because nobody's equipped to do this. Ports were never equipped to provide guidance on health. Neither were local governments or chambers of commerce. So how does this? So we think that the solution obviously involves everybody. And the critical question is, who leads this effort? So, and we hope that this presentation will guide some people to say, yeah, we need to do this. How do we pull everybody together, create what is the system that works for us, and then working with the cruise lines, make sure that this works together with them. So the process is pretty straightforward. Number one, is your community going to work under the system that one of these systems, or are you going to be looking at some sort of a bubble system that will provide that economic impact? And then how do you outreach and talk to people on how to create that? Then the ability to create the operating plan, and then approvals, monitoring, and continuous. So the only way that we've seen it so far, and we're seeing some of the communities in Alaska begin to do, is to assemble a local task force of all of the stakeholders. And really everybody understands that if you don't all come together, then you know the system's going to gravitate to the simplest one of all. Second is then to bring the cruise lines in as part of this, because they will have to agree. It is a partnership between what you want to do. Three, the port needs to set that capacity as per CDC. It might say we don't have a capacity constraint, but it needs to set it. And it has to be credible, because if not, CDC won't give the approval. And then develop what the plan is to meet that. So if you all agree on a certain protocol, a certain bubble, a certain capacity, now you can set the plan aside. Implementation, quite honestly, is the simplest of all, because this might be temporary fencing, some equipment that you need, some tents and so forth. But creating the plan is the most difficult one. And then, as I said, CDC is working this on a short leash. So it is requiring monitoring that this system is working. The last thing is a cruise line want to go to a system like this and then realize that nobody's paying attention to the protocols and somebody gets sick. It's just not going to happen. Nobody can afford that. So it is a process that for us, I think makes sense. And for the folks that are beginning to do it, I think it makes a lot of sense. So, in conclusion, I think everybody and every community needs to set their protocols, and they might be different, but they need to respond to the geography and to the needs of the community. Establish the capacities. We'll need to, this interoperability of approving the plans is critical. And local businesses need to participate in this. Yes, yesterday I was asked the question whether or not it was too much work, and the simplest, let's wait till 2022. And the answer is maybe for some communities it will, but if your business is dependent on this, I'm sure that's not what you want to hear. So to try to come up with a plan that would work for everybody and try to bridge this next year will be very critical. It is a huge undertaking, and cruise lines can't do this by themselves, or they will gravitate to the least complex solutions, or using private destinations, which I think has been clear. They've announced already that it's easier for them to start and go to their islands or the private destination, which means everybody else is sitting around waiting. So that's the reality. And the ability to convene stakeholders, and no matter how you cut it, unless you're a really lucky community, there are going to be conflicting interests. Somebody's going to be on the other side of the line. And unless this is thoughtfully done and purposely done, then there's going to be winners and losers, and that's not a position that anybody wants to be in, but at least has to be tried. So I hope that that the presentations to really give you ideas and thought-provoking on how to do it and how everything fits, but look at the totality of the challenges that everybody has ahead. And the last thing everybody needs to do is keep waiting for somebody else to provide them guidance, because if not, that's what you're going to be doing in months from now. So Larry and Tom, that's it from my end. I'll be glad to take questions, and Mark, and I'll stop sharing the presentation here.
Super. Thanks so much, Louis. That was fantastic. And I know there was quite a few questions that have come in, and Mark's been diligently out there typing the answers. So we've got a few additional ones here, but we do want to take a moment and do a poll. And we'd appreciate everybody taking a few minutes to provide feedback. And if I can impose on you, Mark, to share with people some of the reasons why you want the polls answered, that will help you guys. So here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I think, as Louis said at the beginning of the presentation, we try to keep this up to date as much as possible. And this just provides us with information as to where the communication level is right now, how far we have to go in the process in terms of restart. So even some of the questions that have been posed so far delve into these questions that we've posed. So we're just trying to get an indication of what's been discussed so far and where we need to be. So that's where we are. I've tried to answer as many of the other online questions as possible, and I still see there's a few left, which Louis and I can either answer them now or I can put the answers in. That's up to you, Larry and Tom.
Yeah, I think go ahead and answer them, Mark, if you will, and Louis, since we got the audience still there, and give them a chance to answer the poll questions as well.
All right, so let me start with the one from David about the CDC requirement to minimize the impact on local communities through reducing the number of ship calls will increase the demand for non-traditional home ports. I'm not sure if there's anything specifically within the CDC requirements that say they have to limit the number of ship calls per se. I think that's really up to the individual ports in terms of how they estimate their individual impacts. My sense is during startup, the brands are going to select certain ports for home port operations that allows them to test their protocols, use their downstream private ports call, their private islands, and then begin to work up from there and work with other destinations as well. So I think that'll be limited. I think you're going to see Florida ports, home ports, and probably ports like Galveston that are going to be the primary ports. Louis, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree. I think the impact is going to be more on the ports of call because they have it's not just the port capacity, it's the health system capacity. So a lot of the smaller places that don't have the healthcare capabilities or the evacuation systems in place, those are the ones that could see more of an impact and distribution of more ships. But it's going to take a year for the entire system to come up. And my guess is that I don't see a non-traditional home port operation in this mix at this point because they'll just start using the capacity at the existing home ports and build it up with time.
There's another question on here, I guess a few different times as to the availability of the presentation, and absolutely. We'll share this with anyone, and I believe, Larry, you're going to put this on your site as well, correct?
Absolutely. It'll be on the website, and also we'll send out an email no later than Friday with the link to the presentation as well.
And then the other part of that question was resumption of cruise in the Caribbean. Yeah. As Louis pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, we know, and I think we all understand how devastating this has been, and how important it is to resume cruising into a lot of the islands where their GDP is 50, 75 or more % about tourism and cruise tourism. We do think that the cruise lines are going to concentrate on restarts where they can produce a lot of revenue. I think Alaska, the Baltic, the Mediterranean probably are going to be pretty important as are short cruises out of North America. And I think you're going to see the Caribbean really not get back into play, the deeper Caribbean, with maybe the exception of Mexico, till probably September, October, and into its normal season in November.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is these test ship trials that they have to run, these demonstrations, the ships are on their way. Cruise lines are redeploying the vessels, bringing them back to North America to get ready for that. The question will be is how quickly can they do that, and how quickly can they get CDC to give them the clearance? You can begin to see a perfect storm for the good, where by maybe February, March, you would have a combination of the disease waning because the winter is over, the vaccines taking hold, and these protocols beginning to get placed. So for us, we think it's going to be essential for cruise lines to be able to restart for the winter season. They have to start making money, or at some point in time, they what they've done is incredible to raise so much debt and equity from a business that is not starting, but that will only go so far during the year. So the pressure is there to get that restart. We would have thought that as soon as CDC gave the go, that they would be ready to go with everything, but that didn't happen. So here we are in December, a month later, and it's still pretty quiet out there on all the test cruises. But clearly, we know they're getting ready for that. But will CDC, if they're taking right now almost a month to approve the vaccine that the UK already approved, they approved it today, and the US, they're not even going to meet for another week. It's an absurd thing, but is CDC going to take that same that role? And there's nothing to indicate that they have changed their stance. It's the same people that have been very, very sensitive to cruising. So, but they will restart for sure. They will restart, whether it's January, February, or March. But we're pretty sure with that.
There's a question in here from Anthony. How you doing, Anthony? How many U.S. terminals have committed to upgrade their HVAC systems to provide purified air? Are they doing this in Europe? I only know of one. Louis, I don't know if you're closer to that.
Not many. I think most people again haven't focused on this. So whether or not they have, first of all, in the homeport terminals in North America, the ventilation systems by code in most places require you to recirculate air for energy efficient. So if we were to have designed a terminal and put 100% fresh air, it would have not been approved by the local building officials almost in any governing jurisdiction in the United States, because it would go against the energy code. So now they don't have really, if it's air conditioning, a lot of that means they don't have the cooling capacity to do it all in once, to turn on the fresh air. So they will have to go to recirculating and cleanliness. I've heard of some, but I haven't heard of anybody that can basically announce that now they have a terminal that's using, certain filters or certain UV lights, and that's it, it's and provide that certification. Just don't know of any 100%. I can tell you that we did get an interesting email many years ago. We designed a terminal in Hong Kong, and the operator of Hong Kong wrote us back in, I think in May or June, saying, boy, when we walked in here and we saw negative pressure rooms and quarantine rooms, we thought you guys had gold brick this thing. And now it says, we're so glad that we have it. The same thing's going to happen here. One of the key issues, I think, for a cruise line is to have this resiliency built in. They better be ready to deal with this if it ever happens again. It is a question that's now going to come in between investors in the industry. And the ability to not have a one-time system, but a system that can ramp up and down in the future is going to be critical to everybody's success. So we think it'd be a great investment, but we haven't heard too many.
There's one last question on here, and then we'll let Tom and Larry close. It's concerning social distancing, and would passengers be required to social distance when they get to destinations in terms of transportation? Would buses be required to take less persons? The answer in Europe is absolutely. That is one of the protocols that's in place is social distancing. So if they have a 50 passenger bus, they started off with 25. The last time I spoke with somebody in one of the European ports, they actually had reduced that to a maximum of 15 per coach. And this is something that certainly impacts Alaska and the Caribbean ports because of the different types of tours you all have. And it'll be interesting moving forward as to see how the cruise lines approach this in terms of helicopters and float planes. And will the social distancing be groups, like family groups or groups that travel together? Or how will they approach that? Because I'd say it would be very difficult to turn those types of tours off and just rely on large group types of tours. But again, these are questions, and that's why Lewis and I do this. Those are questions that still need to be asked and answered. And hopefully, brands are speaking with you all about those specific things right now.
Fantastic. Mark and Lewis, this was fabulous, and we appreciate it very much. And to everybody out there, again, thank you for joining us today. Please check in with us on next Wednesday on the 9th with Faces of Tourism in the Caribbean, hosted by Mark Melville. Again, anything that you need as far as the recordings, please visit our website. Everything is there. Please feel free to share the website with others. Again, thanks, Lewis and Mark, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, great, thank you. And to our listeners, many thanks to you all for your continued support. Tom and I really appreciate it. Be strong, be safe, and be healthy. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Lewis, Mark, thank you guys very much. This is wonderful.
Destination together, won't you set me free? I'll take a train, a plane, a big cruise ship. It doesn't really matter to me. Destination people always seem to find the magic and the mystery in